I'm going to try to briefly give you an example here of a disease that starts at the cellular level and the very particular structure in that cell that causes this disease. So let me give you a little bit of background and context here. What is cholesterol? How does it work? Cholesterol is a fat that is made by our livers. Now, we also get it in our diets from eating animal products. So if we eat it in our diets, our livers take a break. If we don't get it in our diets, if say someone's a vegetarian, that's fine, the liver makes it. So what does it do? It stabilizes our cell membranes, but cholesterol is also used to make many other compounds like hormones, testosterone and estrogens, and other corticosteroids, important stress hormones that keep our bodies functioning. So it has a lot of really important jobs in our body. Now, cholesterol travels around our bodies in these little taxis that are called lipoproteins, and they're just like they sound. They're made up of lipids and proteins, but the reason that we have to have these lipoproteins to carry around cholesterol is that cholesterol is a fat and it's not water or blood soluble, and so they have to have these little vehicles to get from one tissue to the next. These little lipoproteins come in different sizes or different densities that we call high or low density, and that's actually what's measured when we get a blood test, when we get labs done to test our cholesterol. It's actually measuring these high or low density lipoproteins, which is telling us about how much cholesterol we have in our blood. And like high and low density are also called good and bad cholesterol, but we do need a little bit of both. We want to have a nice balance of both of those. Now, if our blood concentrations of the low density lipoproteins becomes too great, then it can cause ill effects in our bodies, like clogged arteries and heart disease. So I'm going to go on to tell you about a condition that concerns cholesterol and these lipoproteins. So these little lipoproteins travel around our bodies in our blood carrying this cholesterol, and they enter into our cells through receptor-mediated endocytosis. If you don't remember or that term's unfamiliar with you, go back, read chapter 3, the part about plasma membranes and cell membrane transport. And receptor-mediated endocytosis is a way for our cells to bring stuff inside, because our cells have to take stuff out of our blood in order to get the nutrients, and in this case, the cholesterol that it needs to do other metabolic processes. So these lipoproteins, how do they get into the cells? Well, what they do, so looking at this picture here, I'm going to get my laser pointer. This is our cell membrane here, this little pink line kind of in the middle, and on the cell membrane are these little blue things, and those are representing receptor proteins. These are proteins on the exterior of the cell, and what they do is they bind specific compounds in our blood. In this case, we're talking about lipoproteins, and so we'll say these little stars here are lipoproteins. When they bind to these receptor proteins, it signals that cell membrane to scoop them up and bring them inside. And this is receptor-mediated endocytosis. The cell membrane folds over and it becomes this little vesicle, and the vesicle in this case is holding on to our lipoproteins. Those lipoproteins will go on to deliver their cholesterol packages, and then those cells can use that cholesterol to make whatever they need to. So those lipoproteins bind to those receptor proteins and then are swallowed into the cells, and then the cells go on to use that cholesterol. Now, there's a condition called familial hypercholesteremia that has to do with these little receptor proteins. So this condition, this familial hypercholesteremia, just means it's an inherited condition of a really high cholesterol. So hyper, if you ever see that hyper means, it means high. It's a genetic mutation of a gene called the LDLR gene. And this gene causes a mutation in the receptor protein on the plasma membrane. So it affects about 1 in 250 people worldwide. And even though I'm going to talk about this as if it were one thing, there are actually 5 different classes of this disease. So like many diseases, it's multifaceted. But just to simplify, we're just going to discuss it as if it were one thing. So people with this condition have extremely high blood cholesterol. So measurements of those lipoproteins are greater than 350 nanograms per deciliter. Now, a person with what we would call normal levels of cholesterol would have less than 200 nanograms per deciliter. So 200 is like the max cholesterol level that a person wants to have in their blood that's considered, healthy. There are not many symptoms of this condition. Sometimes people will have little fatty deposits on their skin, on their face, around their eyes. But the main thing here is that it can cause heart disease. So having that really high cholesterol can cause clogged arteries. But why do people with this condition have super high cholesterol? Why is the blood cholesterol so high? Well, thinking about how that receptor-mediated endocytosis works, and as I mentioned before, we have these little receptor proteins here, and those receptor proteins bind our lipoproteins and bring them inside. So people with this condition, their little receptor proteins don't work, or in some cases, they're missing altogether. And so they can't bind our lipoproteins and bring them inside the cell for the cell to use that cholesterol. And so this allows that cholesterol in those lipoproteins to stay in a person's blood, which gives them extremely high cholesterol levels. Now, this is just one example of, in this case, a fault with the plasma membrane and those receptor proteins embedded in that plasma membrane. If you continue reading, there is another example, and I want you to read through that and then just think about which organelle in this scenario could be causing this disease. So something wrong with one of these organelles or cell structures could be causing this disease. Think back to your original thread where you posted and you described these organelles in a few words and what might actually be going on. So there is some background information on that condition as well as some kind of hints that will tell you maybe which organelle is dysfunctioning. So start your thread, post about your organelles, and then make sure you follow up with your ideas on which organelle in this scenario I have posted here might be dysfunctioning.